As followers of Christ, we are all disciples, but you may not necessarily think of yourself as called to be a peacemaker. That might be about to change. I'm David Goretzky, President and CEO of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Welcome to this conversation about discipleship and peacemaking, and the calling we all share to be salt and light in our families, communities, and in our country. In this video, you'll meet Phil Wagler, Global Director of Peace and Reconciliation Network. The network inspires and equips the church to engage in reconciliation. It's a commission of the World Evangelical Alliance and an important part of the work and witness of the EFC in Canada. The Peace and Reconciliation Network exists to inspire and equip the church to enable communities to live life in all its fullness and to see every local evangelical church to be a center of reconciliation. We encourage you to continue this conversation with your community by using the questions Phil will share at the end and that you can find at TheEFC.ca.
Toward the end of my undergraduate degree, the load was heavy and I was newly married, and my wife and I decided I'd quit my part-time job and make one last extra full load semester push to the finish line. I worked for a kind boss who had discipled me as a young Christian, and since I was his only employee, it broke my heart to quit, but he understood. Just a few weeks into this plan, however, my wife lost her job, and suddenly we had no income. And so I quickly took a new part-time position in a local store, one frequented by my former employer. One day he came through the door and I hid. I wanted to avoid him. We had a good relationship, and yet in that moment, I didn't know what to do. I had quit my job, and here I was in a new one, and I'm hiding, I'm devaluing the relationships I had, and also hurting my new employer by slinking about and literally hiding behind shelves. Now, if disrupted peace is possible in such an innocuous situation, how are we to live amid the very real conflicts, unreconciled relationships, and lack of peace invading us on a global scale and in our neighborhoods, workplaces, and schoolyards? How are we to live when peace is shattered in churches and between Christians? It's a challenge to seek peace in the world, in the church, and at home. What does discipleship look like in the big and small conflicts and tensions that make up the human experience? Getting past these obstacles to a flourishing life and flourishing communities is the work of reconciliation and the hope of discipleship. Now, in my church tradition, the story of a 16th century Dutchman was held up as a model for discipleship. Dirk Willems was an Anabaptist Christian running from a local magistrate who sought to drag him back to prison for his radical beliefs. Dirk was fleeing across a frozen lake when his pursuer fell through the ice. And instead of continuing to run, Dirk turned and rescued the man who ultimately jailed him. And in the end, Dirk was burned at the stake. The 20th century theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." The example of Willems and the words of Bonhoeffer remind us of the invitation to surrender our plans and follow Jesus. Discipleship is laying down our will, identities, and agendas to become more and more like Jesus. To be Christian is to be an ambassador of God's message and ministry of reconciliation in an unreconciled world. Just think about the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Go and make disciples of all nations. Disciple all the nations? Now there's a recipe for interethnic conflict. Make a disciple of you and me, and then put us together in something called a local church, a fellowship. Now there's a make-work project. Jesus says that to be a disciple is to observe, preserve, and keep intact all that he commanded the first disciples. And we are all disciples and children of God, as messy as we can be. The cross of Jesus and the resurrection has changed everything. The cross is the place where God destroyed the dividing wall of hostility that exists between people. this new and united household of the people of God is something the world had never seen. When we are disciples, we live our faith out personally, but also together with others who are also learning these new ways. And we're going to encounter a peace like no other in all our relationships when we do this work. Discipleship is the high call of becoming like Jesus, the Son of God. And for Jesus, peacemaking was central to his holy family identity and mission. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, Jesus said, "Blessed or happy or to be greatly envied are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." To be a peacemaker, not a peacekeeper, is to act like God's daughter or son. It is to be like Jesus, expressing the family dynamics of God's family. Because God is the ultimate reconciler. And so the gospel is inherently about God reconciling the world to himself and making peace with us while we were God's enemies. To be a disciple is to be a peacemaker. That is who we are in this world today. So will we stick our heads in the sand while the world quakes? No. Just ask Dirk Willems or Christians living in or coming from places of violence and persecution around this world. Discipleship as peacemaking is a call to radical, prophetic, courageous, prayerful Christ-likeness. It's to put into practice every day the story we live out when we gather at our Lord's table in our local fellowships and take the bread and take the cup as a sign of peace with God and with one another. And as we proclaim in that act the Lord's death until he comes again. It's awakening to the humanity of others, including those that we so easily label enemy. So, where do you see fractured, polarized realities? I bet you can name a few, and I suspect you're involved in at least one. So how will your local church form peacemaking disciples for such a time as this? How will your church work through the issues dividing Christians so that we are bringers of God's good news today? The prophet Isaiah said that the day would come when the desperate nations would stream toward the people of God because they know the Lord of all the earth, and they will say in hope, he will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. He'll settle disputes between many peoples, and they'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Now, injustice, wars, and rumors of war, they abound. Disputes between peoples exist all around. And everyone is looking for shade to call their own where no one will make them afraid. And it is in this mess we are to go and make disciples of all nations. Friends, this work begins with you and me, with our churches, walking with Jesus in the power of the Spirit and becoming more and more like him, the Prince of Peace, for the sake of the world that God so loved. This is a deep wrestling to form communities where people are reconciled to God, with themselves, with one another, and with God's creation. And on that day, a long time ago, when I hid like a frightened kid behind store shelves, I knew then that there had to be a better way. A few weeks later, I found my old boss, confessed this awkwardness and how I hid, and it just sounds so silly even now talking about it. But my boss forgave me, and we restored our relationship, and he continued to be a blessing in my life. We can do that work every day. We can do that work in our lives and relationships, in our churches and communities, and globally as well. It is our privilege to be people of reconciliation. It is our responsibility to do the theological, spiritual, relational, social, and missional work that will reveal that we are disciples of the Prince of Peace. We are called and sent to be those kind of people. Did that feel like a lot? May have, especially if the idea of being a peacemaker as well as a disciple is a new thought for you and your community. But let me encourage you. Even if peacemaking might sound like another thing to do, it is a joyful and rewarding practice that can become the part of your lifestyle, in fact, is meant to be as a follower of Jesus. So I encourage you to continue this journey by talking about it. I learn so much in dialogue with other people, and good conversation is part of peacemaking too. So here are a few questions you can toss around in a group or with another friend. Can you think of a time when you were called upon to be a peacemaker? Share that experience and talk about how it felt and what you learned. Broaden your perspective from your personal experience to your community or country of origin, whether that is Canada or not. What are some of the issues that are calling out for peacemakers today? How could you be involved? It's always better to work together, and it's probably essential when we're talking about peacemaking. Who can you collaborate with in this work? Who is already at work that you could join in with? The Peace and Reconciliation Network has more resources to help you in this work. Come and find us online, and let's build peace together.